Good morning, everyone, on this fine end of February winter morning. Welcome to First Church Unitarian's all online virtual service. My name is Monica Pilman, and I am currently serving as a deacon of this congregation. So we're still in red mode, obviously. However, the executive team will be getting together on March 9th to decide what we're going to do about that going forward. Today's service, you should know, is going to be led by our very own Clement and Kathryn Pfaltzgraff. Also, the nominating committee is looking for a few good people to assume some important volunteer positions here at FCU. If you are at all interested, or if there's somebody that you think would be great, please let the nominating committee know. As Reverend Laura said in the community matters, it has been an unsettling week this week. We find ourselves still in the midst of pandemic times, and at the same time, we've got terrible news out of Ukraine, and we've got terrible news about our trans brothers and sisters living in Texas and Florida in our country. I suggest we all send them our thoughts and prayers. I suggest we do more than that in the future. It's an interesting looking Community Matters this week. I urge you to have a look at it. There's plenty of good things in there for you to see that's going on our church environment. Thank you, and I forgot to provide myself with the dinger today.
No, we have to ding.
Mike says we have to ding. Yeah. So, all right.
Good morning. I'm Molly Lozeau, the music director, and the assistant music director is wandering around somewhere. I wanted to introduce the Prelude for today. It's called Sunswept, and it's by Adrienne Albert. And you might have been at this concert. It took place, I think, in 2018 in the Sanctuary, and it was myself and my flute friend, Rebecca Jeffries. So we have this recording for you. Of several years ago. And I just wanted to say Adrienne Albert is a composer who lives in California, and she is a active flute player, and she writes a lot of flute music, and Rebecca has played with her before. And I'd say if you enjoy the piece, you should check out her website and listen to some other of her compositions. I think they're really beautiful.
This is how we are called. In the hours before the birds stream airborne with chiming voice, a silent breath rests in the pines and upholds the surface of the lake as if it was a fragile bubble in the very hand of God. And this is how we were called, to cup our hands and hold this peace, even when the sirens begin, even when sorrow cries old and gnarled, even when words grow fangs and rend. Cupped hands gently open, supporting peace, like the golden hollow of a singing bowl, like the towering rim of mountains cradling this slumbering and mist-draped valley.
The flaming chalice is the symbol of our Unitarian Universalist heritage, lit by congregations this morning around the country and around the world. I invite you, if you have a chalice or a candle at home, to join with Sierra Miller, who will light our chalice and lead us in the words of covenant for our church.
And I will allow you to unmute as soon as I can find you. Please unmute.
Loves the spirit of this church and serves its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm the Reverend Jackie Clement, and I am just delighted to be here with the Reverend Kathryn Pfaltzgraff as we offer our service that we put up for the auction and that was bought by Joyce Williams this morning. So we're glad to see all of you. If you are visiting with us for the first time, know that you are very welcome, and we're happy that you found us here online, as we are all awaiting the time when we can be together in person once again. If you would like to know a little more about First Church Unitarian in Littleton, I invite you to check out our website, fculittle.org. And on there you can see previous services, and right below the box on the homepage where you can see last week's service, you'll find something which says virtual pew card, and if you click on that, someone from the church can be in touch with you if you'd like to have a conversation with us. This week, our lay pastoral minister is David Butts, so if you have a pastoral concern, would like to speak with someone, I invite you to reach out to David. But as we begin this service this morning in hopes of being together once again, let us gather to make a joyful noise. Molly?
All right.
Where is it? Where is it, Mama?
Natalie's looking for her ukulele. I don't know. You're going to have to look. It's time to unmute and get an instrument if you have something. And we're going to make some noise and welcome each other. Are people able to unmute?
I'm gonna get something for you.
Okay, come on, honey. It's time. All right, we get people unmuting. Natalie, come here, please. Roll back. Ready?
Let me make sure I'm muted.
3, 2, 1, go.
Good morning.
Three, two, one, stop. I'm still going. Keep taking the bag.
Thanks, honey.
That was an awesome noise. Thank you. I invite you, if there are children nearby, to invite them to look at the screen as we share a story for everyone. This is the book You Forgot Your Skirt, Amelia Bloomer, by Shana Corey, illustrated by Chesley McLaren. You forgot your skirt, Amelia Bloomer. Amelia Bloomer was not a proper lady. In fact, Amelia Bloomer thought proper ladies were silly. She thought it was silly that proper ladies were not allowed to vote, so she tried to change the laws so that they could. Good grief, people said. Amelia Bloomer thought it was silly that proper ladies were not supposed to work, so she started her own newspaper and went to work on that. She named the newspaper The Lily. It was a special newspaper all about women. She hired other women to work on it, too. A shame, people said. Work? Why work? But the silliest thing of all, thought Amelia Bloomer, was the way proper ladies were supposed to dress. Their dresses were so heavy, wearing them was like carting around a dozen bricks. What was proper about that? Their dresses were so long that proper ladies looked like walking broomsticks. They acted like broomsticks, too, because their skirts swept up all the mud and trash from the street. What was proper about that? The corsets they wore underneath their dresses were so tight it was hard to breathe in them. Proper ladies were fainting at the drop of a hat. What was proper about that? And the hoops they wore beneath their dresses were so wide that no matter how they squeezed, no matter how they squished and squashed and stuffed themselves through, proper ladies still got stuck in doorways all over town. What in the world was proper about that? Even little girls had to wear proper dresses so they couldn't run or jump or play. This has got to stop, declared Amelia Bloomer. One day, Amelia's friend Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to visit. Elizabeth brought her cousin Libby with her. Libby looked remarkable. She was even more improper than Amelia, because Libby was not wearing a dress. Dresses, said Libby. Bah, how silly. Instead of a dress, Libby was wearing something that was not too heavy, and not too long, and not too tight, and not too wide. It looked just right. Brilliant, announced Amelia. And she went right to her sewing machine and sewed a matching outfit for herself. Then she went out for a walk. The townspeople were aghast. Can you believe it? You forgot your skirt, Amelia Bloomer, called the little boy. Shocking, everyone said. But Amelia didn't care one bit. She thought the new clothes were wonderful. She ran and jumped and twirled and did all the things she had always wanted to do. Amelia had such a good time that she wanted other women to know about the new clothes too. So when she got home, she wrote about them in the Lily. Marvelous, said a lady from Boston. I declare, said a lady from Charleston. Where can I get one? Asked a lady from Baltimore. Pretty soon Amelia had letters from women everywhere. They all wanted patterns so they could make the new clothes themselves. Some of them even wanted tips on what to wear with the new style. Some called the new style of clothes the American costume. Most people just called them bloomers. Of course, not everyone liked bloomers. Humph, said one very proper gentleman. Balderdash, said another. This can only lead to more rights for women, grumbled a third. Over time, bloomers went out of style. Proper ladies and gentlemen everywhere breathed a sigh of relief. Thank goodness, they said. Now everyone will forget this nonsense and things can return to normal. But did people really forget all about Amelia Bloomer and her improper ideas? Well, what do you think? At the same time that Amelia Bloomer was changing the way women lived, there was another woman who thought it was silly that women couldn't do the things they wanted. Her name was Olympia Brown. Like Amelia, she adopted the new costume and worked for women's right to vote. But the thing Olympia thought was silliest was that women couldn't be ministers. So she went right ahead and became the first woman ordained in the United States. In 1863, Olympia Brown became the first woman to be a Universalist minister. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me learning about some of our very improper ancestors.
We are called to bear witness. In the midst of a world marked by tragedy and beauty, there must be those who bear witness against unnecessary destruction and who, with faith, stand and lead in freedom with grace and power. There must be those who speak honestly and do not avoid seeing what must be seen of sorrow and outrage, or tenderness and wonder. There must be those whose grief troubles the water, while their voices sing and speak refreshed worlds. There must be those whose exuberance rises with lovely energy that articulates the earth's joy. There must be those who are restless for respectful and loving companionship among human beings, whose presence invites people to be themselves without fear. There must be those who gather with the congregation of remembrance and compassion, draw water from old wells, and walk the simple path of love for neighbor. And there must be communities of people who seek to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God, who call on the strength of soul force to heal, transform, and bless life. There must be religious witness. The religious witness of our congregation remains strong because of your generous support. If you would like to contribute to the work of the church, you can go to the website fculittle.org and look for the yellow donate button, or you can send a check to the First Church Unitarian, 19 Foster Street, Littleton, 01460. And thank you for your contributions, not only of finances, but of time, talents, and compassion.
And the music we'll hear for the offertory is called Adoration. It is an organ piece written by Florence B. Price. I've been trying to work in more works by not only female composers, but African American composers into my repertoire. And I found this piece for organ, and it's very beautiful. And you will recognize the organ. Enjoy.
Our first reading this morning comes from an article, The Ordination of Amelia A. Frost, written by Annabel Ober Conant in the women's column of March 10th, 1894, found in the Littleton Historical Society collection.
So sorry.
I'm not sure what of that you heard, so I repeat.
We heard you. We heard you. But we heard what
okay.
the reading was.
So this is the reporting of the ordination of Amelia Frost at the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church at Littleton, Mass. was a place of more than local interest on Wednesday, February 14th, 1894. At 10 a.m., a goodly number of intelligent and sympathetic people, with a sprinkling of those who were antipathetic, gathered in the church over which Reverend George B. Frost is pastor, to listen to the examination of Mrs. Frost, the wife of pastor, by reason of his insufficient health to be associate pastor. The council represented through clerical and lay delegates 10 churches. Dr. Quint of Boston, do you feel called to the ministry? An increased intentness on all faces. Mrs. F, I cannot doubt it. Dr. Q, why did you preach at first? Mrs. F, to please my husband. Smiles of approval from all the men. Here, the inevitable question which everyone had expected was propounded by an elderly delegate who had the air of asking the unanswerable. I should like to ask Mrs. Frost if she believes that the Bible points toward women preaching, or if it were ever intended she should preach. Mrs. F, it seems so in my case. Delegate, I had hoped Mrs. Frost would be able to give some Bible warrant. Mrs. F, your sons and daughters shall prophesy. At this immediate and sufficient answer, the overcharged audience laughed and clapped its hands, and as it had become evident by this time that there was a candidate before the council who could provide ready and concise answers to as many questions as their combined astuteness chose to put, a motion for adjournment was carried. The route to ordination was a little different for me than for Amelia Frost. For one thing, I didn't get the job because my husband had it first and got ill. My ordination was granted by this congregation, and y'all didn't ask me if I knew anything about the Bible. But to be associated with the UUA, I did have to go before a council of my peers and demonstrate competence, just as every other minister in our tradition from the Puritans on down have done. Even though the Universalists were the first denomination to ordain a woman in the U.S., Olympia Brown in 1863, as I mentioned, during the Time for All Ages, we shouldn't believe that it opened the gates for women in ministry in any significant way. It was more than a century before any significant number of women were ordained. Indeed, the greatest change for women in ministry has come during my adult life, and in large part during the years that I've served in ministry. Until the 1970s, the heyday for women in Unitarian or Universalist ministry was in the late 19th century. Over the course of about 2 decades, approximately 70 women known as the Iowa Sisterhood were ordained in the Midwest, far from the Boston establishment, though far fewer than the 70 ever served in churches. In response, Sam Elliott, who was then president of the American Unitarian Association, came up with the idea to include women in the annual assembly of the denomination by having them wait on the tables at a luncheon arranged, and I quote, for the men. Sam did not like women in ministry. Congregational polity might force the powers that be to recognize the women's ordination, but it certainly didn't force them to accept the women as equals. The Western experiment didn't last long. But a century later, with the rise of the women's movement, the UUA began recruiting women to the ministry. Libby Stoddard, the first woman ordained by this congregation in 1979, and Nanine Gowdy, the first woman called to serve here in 1988, were among them. But as the Iowa Sisterhood showed, ordination does not necessarily mean equality. Even in the 2000s, when I was ordained, when more than 50% of our ministers were women, prestigious and larger churches were assumed to call male ministers. When I was settled at the congregation I served in Illinois, I was the first woman called a senior minister in their 250-year history. There was one vote against calling me, with the explicitly stated reason that it was because I was a woman. Women, and particularly women of color, have been far more likely to serve in assistant or religious education ministries than lead roles. But it is not simply the availability of pulpits and equal pay that women face. It is also widespread sexual harassment, sometimes from congregants, but most disappointingly from colleagues. Much of this is beginning to change. It's now been several decades that women have been the majority of our ministry. Denomination-wide, women are now being called as senior ministers and being called to large and prestigious pulpits. The enforcement of the ministerial guidelines is beginning to shed light on sexual misconduct, and leaders are being called to account. It really is different in many ways for women in ministry than it was when you ordained me in 2004. But to talk about only male and female ministers is to set up a false binary. Diversity in all aspects is lacking in our ministry. LGBTQ, non-binary, ethnic, and racial diversity is still lacking. And again, it isn't just about how many people are ordained, but about how they are embraced as leaders. In the words of my colleagues, Jose Ballester and Patricia Jimenez, we UUs like to think that we are free thinkers, critical of the norms of our larger society, and we pride ourselves in our history of civil disobedience. We are, and we should. However, we are not as free as we'd like to think we are. We UUs are as bound by the values, beliefs, and behaviors imposed by the founders from the very inception of the United States. In a week where we saw the first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court, I can't help but feel the weight of those words. Kathryn?
Before I talk about the ordination of women in the Church of the Brethren, I think I need to give you a little bit of background and some sense of who the Church of the Brethren is. The denomination traces its beginnings to a small, small town in Germany in 1708. They are non-creedal and claim the New Testament as their only guide and creed. They believed Jesus intended his followers to live a life based on peaceful action, plain and compassionate living, and a shared search for truth. Sounds almost UU, doesn't it? They considered following Jesus to be a serious commitment which could not be made until a believer was old enough to know what they were committing themselves to, or until they were old enough to actually get married. Like the UU, the Church of the Brethren is community-oriented. Like the UU, the church has the Church of the Brethren has had difficulty attracting people who are different different than themselves. Both denominations emphasize service and justice over evangelism. Last Sunday, Reverend Laura quoted a UU as saying something that really reminded me of a similar quote often repeated in the Church of the Brethren. It is, preach every day. Use words if you must. In spite of some similarities, there are glaring differences. The early Church of the Brethren did not trust education and did not accept the idea of professional paid ministry until fairly recently. Some of our congregations, our conservative congregations, still call ministers from their own communities and do not encourage seminary education. The Church of the Brethren uses titles very sparingly. And since all Christians are called to be ministers of the word, most pastors do not wear stoles or robes. Although not all members agree, I am happy that the Church of the Brethren teaches that all war is sin. I am not at all happy that most members of the Church of the Brethren do not support any variation on being heterosexual. Again, fortunately, not all members agree, and a few congregations are open and affirming. Even fewer congregations have called homosexual couples serving in church leadership. Like most of the society at the time, the early church frowned on women in leadership, especially church leadership. Our earliest recorded woman minister was Sarah Ryder Major. In 1826, she felt the call to ministry. She was very slow to share her calling with anyone, but when she did, she found support from her father and from her local congregation. She began preaching publicly at the Philadelphia church in 1832. Sarah knew how the brethren felt about women ministers. They took Paul's teaching very seriously that women were to be silent in church. Just like the UU women who preached, Sarah always remained respectful of the leadership of men, which often softened the resistance to her speaking. She continued preaching until the end of her life in 1884. There were other women who preached in their local congregations. Some women were encouraged by their husbands who admitted their wives were better preachers than they were. The Church of the Brethren did not concern themselves with titles, so some of the early women in leadership listed themselves as ordained, some as permanently licensed, and some just as ministers. In 1922, the Church of the Brethren annual conference caught up with the practice of women ministers and permitted women to be licensed to preach. It was not until 1958 that the church conference granted women the right to be ordained. Around the same time, in 1922, the Church of the Brethren started mission work in Nigeria. Couples and single women, note that I do say single women, they didn't trust single men to go overseas by themselves for long term. Single women were sent to serve as nurses, doctors, and teachers. By the time I was born in Nigeria, single women were serving as nurses at clinics in the bush. They also taught Bible study, and they set an example that I thought I could follow. I'm going to read a story which has touched me deeply over the years, and I have shared it many times. It is the fire starter. After many years of labor, an inventor discovered the art of making fire. He took his tools to show to the snow-clad northern regions and initiated a tribe into the art and the advantages of making fire. The people became so absorbed in this novelty that it did not occur to them to thank the inventor, who one day quietly slipped away. Being one of those rare human beings who was endowed with greatness, he had no desire to be remembered or revered. All he sought was the satisfaction of knowing that someone benefited from his discovery. The next tribe he went to was just as eager to learn as the first, but the local priests, jealous of the stranger's hold on the people, had him assassinated. To allay any suspicion of the crime, they had a portrait of the great inventor enthroned on the main altar of the temple, and a liturgy designed so that his name would be revered and his memory kept alive. The greatest care was taken so that not one single rubric of the liturgy was altered or omitted. The tools for making the fire were enshrined within a casket and were said to bring healing to all those who laid their hands on it with faith. The high priest himself undertook the task of compiling the life of the inventor. This became the holy book in which the inventor's loving kindness was offered as an example for all to emulate. His glorious deeds were eulogized. His superhuman nature was made an article of faith. The priests saw to it that the book was handed down to future generations while they authoritatively interpreted the meaning of his words and the significance of his holy life and death. And they ruthlessly punished with death or excommunication anyone who deviated from their doctrine. Caught up as they were in these religious tasks, the people completely forgot the art of making fire. I was in college when I decided to follow the call to ministry. It felt like the next natural step in my life. I had taught Sunday school and talked about mission work in various churches. I had seen single women in active ministry on the mission field. So I was shocked when the Church of the Brethren district in Tennessee was reluctant to affirm my call. However, I did find support in the local church I attended. At the time, I was not able to go to our seminary in Chicago, so I took the 3-year reading course, which was offered as an alternative to attending seminary. And of course, that would not have been something that I don't think the UU would have allowed. When I completed the course, I was licensed into ministry and started filling the pulpit and serving as interim pastor in various churches in Tennessee and Alabama. But I decided not to be ordained until I was called to serve a congregation as pastor. In 1982, I moved to Arcadia, Florida, to serve my first congregation, and I was ordained in 1983. The Arcadia Church of the Brethren was very small. A previous minister served the Church of the Brethren in Arcadia until his death in 1946. After his death, his widow served the little church. After her death, several retired ministers served the church as interim pastors. But Reverend Samuel Bale's wife Elizabeth Bale was not forgotten. Her loving, capable leadership paved the way for me to lead that congregation. Women were often called to very small congregations which could not support a full-time pastor. When I left the Arcadia church, I went to another place they often placed women in ministry, a multiple staff congregation. There I served as minister of education, children's ministry, and witness. The local ministerial association welcomed me and asked me, as the only female that was there, to be secretary. I told them I was lousy at taking notes, but I'd be happy to take a role, say, of president. What do you know? They elected me. Well, I'm going to skip over 20 plus years of serving congregations and attending seminary to 2007 when I took a position as chaplain at a retirement community. I enjoyed the freedom that I found visiting people from different faiths. My task was to help the people wherever they were on their spiritual journey. I was always honest about being more theocentric than Christocentric, meaning God-centered rather than Christ or Jesus-centered. I have seen God at work in many different ways and through many different faiths. Faith in Jesus might be helpful to a lot of people and had been to me, but it is not the only path to God. I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh who said, "Do not mistake the finger pointing toward the moon as the moon." I was deeply troubled by some of the teachings of the church. I could not comfortably say the traditional communion words, "The bread which we break is the communion of the body of Christ." My co-workers at the time did not understand my hesitancy, but were happy to cover for me. I could not say that Jesus was the one and only Savior, so I kept my mouth shut on that one. There were ways to be indirect at times. When a recent widow said, "I know God has a plan. He took my husband for a reason." I didn't believe it, but I could say in all honesty, yes, it is a comfort to many Christians to believe that God is always in control. I could tell the story. I could use the language of Christian faith. I could sing comforting songs and recite familiar scriptures to the dying. I could do my job, but I had lost my integrity. I went to my supervisor one day to talk about my doubts. I hoped that she could listen, but she didn't. She said, "If you do not believe in Jesus as Lord and Savior, you do not belong here." The following week, I began planning my retirement. The fire of my beloved childhood faith had died. I needed integrity for the Spirit to blow and relight the fire of my faith. Now I consider the UU as my home.
There are multiple sparks of fire in my call and in my ministry. Some of them have burned themselves out over the years. New ones have been lit. But the greatest one of all is described in the story of the fire starter. It is, in one word, possibility. One of the reasons I choose to be a UU and chose to be ordained in this denomination was that it is an organic religion, one that starts with the questions of the people. The body of belief is built out of our quest for meaning and truth. That means that truth is ever expanding. As the questions change, as we and our understandings change, so too does our faith. There exists at every moment possibility. This, I believe, is the fire from the story. It is the meaning created out of immediacy and experience. And this is why it is imperative that we continue to change the face of Unitarian Universalist ministry. Without women moving fully into leadership, without LGBTQ and non-binary folks, without a full range of ethnic and racial diversity, our ministry and our faith will be constrained to the experience of the few. It must certainly fail to be the universal religion envisioned by the 20th century Universalists that Reverend Laura described last week. Without a continual broadening, this faith, we might as well write down the creed to say faithfully every week, never changing. We might as well adhere to the words of prophets from centuries ago. We might as well become the religions described in the fire starter story, whose truth is buried under the weight of ritual and false gravitas. Despite a late start, this congregation actually has a pretty good track record of opening to the possibilities of diversity. 3 of the last 4 ministers have been women, 2 gay, 1 a person of color. Of the last 4 ministers ordained here, 2 were women, 1 gay, and 1 person of color. We can continue to be that voice of inclusion in our wider denomination, despite being bound by the values, beliefs, and behaviors of the founders. We have the power to effect denominational change in who we encourage into ministry, in who we train as interns, who we call as ministers, who we hire as staff, and how we use our votes at General Assembly each year. Sí, se puede. Yes, us. Here in Littleton, this is the spark of possibility that beckons.
Our closing hymn and musical reflection is sung by the church choir, which I'm assuming is led by Molly. The hymn is number 298, in our hymnal. And Jackie and I chose it for a couple different reasons. I see this hymn as having very familiar tune. And if you have your hymnal with you, you can turn to it and sing along. But the words are powerful, calling us to witness to beauty and truth and love, compassion in the world around us. Verse 5, wake now my vision of ministry clear, brighten my pathway with radiance here, mingle my calling with all who will share, work toward a planet transformed by our care. That's our calling, to be a witness in a world that needs our words.
With our senses and hearing of God.
There is so much to know, so much to love, so much to share. Let us go forth this day and minister. There are forsaken elements in each of us, abandoned dreams, neglected fears, breast closet skeletons, tremendous possibilities as yet untapped. Let us minister to ourselves. There are broken relationships among the people, friends we need to touch, partners we need to love, enemies we need to forgive. Let us minister to each other. There is sorrow in the land, war, pollution, injustice, a tragic squandering of immense wealth. Let us minister to our world. And there is a forgotten cry within us all, a deafening silence, largely unheeded, but ever beckoning. Home. Home, it calls, an explosion of joy waiting to be born. Let us minister to our source. There is so much to know, so much to love, so much to share. Let us go forth this day and minister. Let us go forth and light the fires. With these words from Reverend Dan O'Neill, I close our service, but not our time together. If you are on YouTube, I invite you to join us on Zoom following our postlude, where we will share the joys and concerns and announcements of our congregation.
Assistant Director, you want to announce the postlude?
Uh-huh. Today's postlude is very special. It was an auction request by Joyce Williams. And you'll be hearing the chorale from Jupiter on the organ.